The photograph is one of the most famous in American history, but the woman in it had a name, and on the night it was taken, she was not a symbol. She was a mother, hiding her face because she had just told her children they would have to eat the frozen vegetables from the ruined field for dinner again. This is not a story about a picture. This is the story of what happened in the darkness just outside the frame. Her name was Florence Owens Thompson. She was 32 years old, Cherokee, and stranded with her 7 children in a frozen labor camp in California. The public saw a symbol of endurance, but in that moment, she was facing a mother's most primal calculus: how to keep her children alive through the night with no food, no money, and no one coming to help. This is what happens when that calculation runs out of options, and a desperate act becomes the only one left. To understand how Florence ended up in that tent, you have to understand the invisible machinery that crushed her. It wasn't just the stock market. It was a deliberate system that turned people like her into fuel. Florence was born Florence Leona Christie in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, in 1903. Her Cherokee mother died when she was young. By 17, she had married, and by the time the Depression hit, she was a mother of 6 picking cotton in the fields of the San Joaquin Valley. She could pick 400, sometimes 500 pounds a day. That weight, that physical calculus, was the only currency she had. The system was built on it. California's vast agricultural empires needed a massive, mobile, and desperate workforce. Growers created a labor pipeline that funneled thousands of families from the Dust Bowl states straight into the fields. They advertised high wages and steady work. What they delivered was something else entirely. Families would arrive after a brutal journey only to find the pay was a fraction of what was promised. The work was sporadic, and the camps were squalid collections of tents and shacks with no clean water and no sanitation. This was by design. A hungry, rootless worker is a cheap worker. A mother worried about her children's next meal won't complain about wages. Florence and her family became units in this human harvest. They followed the crops: beans, peas, cotton. Living in their car or in canvas tents, chasing rumors of work that always seemed to vanish just as they arrived. Then, in March of 1936, they followed the rumor of pea-picking work to Nipomo, California. The promise was good wages. The reality was a catastrophe. Unusually late rains had frozen and ruined the entire pea crop. There was no work. But by the time hundreds of migrant families like Florence's arrived, it was too late. They were stranded. No money, no food, nowhere to go. The camp at Nipomo became a prison of frost and hunger. Families burned whatever wood they could find to keep from freezing. Food was what you could scavenge. Children killed small birds to eat. Families survived on the frozen vegetables left rotting in the fields. This is where Florence made her stand. She had 7 children to feed. Her husband had taken their car to get repairs, stranding them. She had just sold the tires from that car to buy food. That food was now gone. So when her children cried from hunger, she did the only thing she could. She took the frozen peas and carrots from the field and she boiled them, again. And as she told her children this was dinner, she turned her face away from them. The shame was a physical weight. It was in that exact moment that a car pulled up on the muddy road beside the camp. A woman got out, carrying a large Graflex camera. She was Dorothea Lange, a photographer working for the Federal Resettlement Administration. She had been driving past on her way back to San Francisco after a month-long assignment. She almost didn't stop. She later wrote that a voice told her to turn around. She approached the camp, her camera raised. She saw Florence and the children huddled in the tent. She took 6 photographs. The last one, where Florence stares into the distance with her hand to her face, her children burrowing into her shoulders, would become the 6th photograph, the one the world remembers. Lange spoke to Florence for only 10 minutes. She asked no personal questions, took no notes on her name. Florence later said she felt as if the photographer was not seeing her, but taking something from her. Lange promised the photographs would not be published. She then got back in her car and drove away. She drove straight to a newspaper office in San Francisco and told an editor about the starving families in Nipomo. The story and one of the photographs ran the next day. Upon seeing it, the federal government rushed 20,000 pounds of food to the camp. The food arrived, But Florence and her family were already gone. They had packed their wet tent and left before the aid trucks ever arrived, still chasing work, still invisible. The photograph had saved the camp, but it had not saved her. And that single frame, divorced from her name, her story, and her specific desperation, began its journey around the world. It became Migrant Mother, an icon, a symbol of the Great Depression's stoic endurance. But for Florence, the moment that made her famous was the moment her real struggle was erased, and the system that put her there was just getting started. Because while the public saw a powerful portrait, a different set of people saw something else entirely. They saw proof that their system was working perfectly, and they were determined to keep it running, no matter the cost. The photograph achieved what Florence could not. It moved the government. But the aid that arrived in Nipomo was a paradox. It proved the system could respond to a crisis, but only when that crisis was made beautiful and silent. Florence Owens Thompson was not silent. She was a woman with a voice, a history, and a growing fury. And as her image circled the globe, her real life descended into a deeper, more private struggle. She continued to migrate, picking cotton and beets, living in labor camps and in the old car. Her children remember her working until her hands bled, hiding her face when social workers came to camp, terrified they would take her children if they saw how poor they were. The iconic portrait of maternal strength became, for her, a passport into a shadow life defined by fear of exposure. Meanwhile, the photograph took on a life of its own. It was reproduced in newspapers, magazines, and government pamphlets. It was celebrated as a masterpiece of documentary photography. It won awards. Dorothea Lange's career was made, but there was a critical, deliberate omission. The subject was never named. She was always Migrant Mother, a universal symbol. This was not an accident. Naming her would have made her specific. It would have introduced complications, her Cherokee heritage, her tenacity, her anger. A symbol is easier to manage than a person, and the agricultural powers in California wanted their workforce managed, not humanized. Because at the very same moment Lange's photograph was tugging the nation's heartstrings, a different kind of document was circulating in the halls of power. Growers' associations were lobbying fiercely against any federal aid or rights for migrant workers. They argued that providing decent housing or a minimum wage would spoil the labor pool, make them less mobile, less desperate. The same desperation captured so artfully in Migrant Mother was, to them, a vital economic indicator. It meant labor was cheap and plentiful. Florence's face had become the most recognizable image of the Depression, yet the economic forces that put her in that tent were strengthening. But what about the other mothers? The ones not framed by a famous photographer? Their stories were recorded, not in pictures, but in piles of paper buried in archives. During the 1930s, nearly 600 letters from mothers arrived at the White House and the Children's Bureau. They were not writing about abstract hardship. They were writing with ink made from pure panic. Historian Emily K. Abel spent years analyzing these letters. They are almost all from mothers pleading for help for a specific, desperately sick child. A mother in Texas needs insulin for her diabetic son. A woman in Minnesota needs serum for a child with spinal meningitis. They write with a meticulous, heartbreaking detail, listing every home remedy tried, every local doctor visited, every last penny spent. They rarely state the obvious, that this is a matter of life and death. They don't have to. The terror is in the careful handwriting, in the pressed-down plea for someone, anyone in authority, to see their child. These letters reveal a terrifying truth. The official safety net was a myth. Women were at the mercy of local officials, and the system was failing to provide the most basic health care for impoverished children. The mothers writing these letters had done everything society asked of them. They had nursed their children tirelessly. They had sacrificed every luxury. And they had been left with one final, humiliating option: to write a begging letter to a distant, faceless government, hoping a stranger would care more than their own community did. This was the real, unfiltered backdrop to Florence's famous portrait. Not just a bad season, but a nationwide collapse of care, where a mother's love and labor were not enough to keep a child alive. And here is the most devastating part. Only a small fraction of these women ever received help. The system that could rush 20,000 pounds of food to a camp because of a photograph could not muster a vial of insulin for a child because of a letter. The response was dictated not by need, but by optics. Florence, unknowingly, had become the ultimate optician. She had made need visible, but for every one of her, there were tens of thousands of invisible mothers, their voices fading into the static of bureaucracy. This pattern of isolation and desperation was not confined to the 30s or to migrant trails. It was built into the American frontier itself. While Florence was picking cotton in California, a different kind of maternal drama was unfolding in the remote hills of Kentucky. Here, doctors were so scarce they were practically folklore. In Leslie County, childbirth was a deadly gamble. Then, in 1925, a woman named Mary Breckinridge arrived. A trained nurse who had tragically lost both her children, she founded the Frontier Nursing Service. She recruited midwives, trained them, and sent them out on horseback into the most isolated hollows. These nurses rode through torrential rains and snow, day and night, to deliver bobbies and treat sick children. They provided what the state did not: direct human intervention. In their first decade, they delivered over 3,000 bobbies with astoundingly low mortality rates for the era. The Frontier Nursing Service worked because it bypassed the broken system entirely. It met mothers where they were, in their homes, in their desperation. It recognized that geography was a disease and isolation was a symptom, but it was a tiny rebellion against a vast reality. For every hollow they reached, 100 others remained in the dark. This geographic betrayal of mothers continued, and it was codified in places like eastern Montana in the early 1900s. Homesteading women, there were pioneers in a terrifying sense. Vast majority had no prenatal care. One 19-year-old mother, alone on the prairie, gave birth by herself when her husband was away. She delivered the baby, cut the cord, and was so weakened she couldn't work for 6 months. Another woman's planned trip to a doctor was blocked by a sudden blizzard. She delivered in a cabin, assisted only by her nervous husband. Survival was the only metric of success. The system wasn't just failing these women. It had never been built for them in the first place. They existed in a medical desert a century before the term was invented. And this brings us to the shocking, invisible thread connecting Florence Owens Thompson in her frozen tent, the mothers writing those desperate letters, and the homesteaders of Montana. The crisis never ended. It just changed its address. Today, over 35% of U.S. counties are classified as maternity care deserts. These are places with no hospital offering obstetric care, no birth centers, no obstetric providers. They are home to 2.3 million women and see 150,000 births every year. The geography of abandonment has been meticulously mapped, and the consequences are written in a modern statistic that should shame the nation. Maternal mortality in the United States more than doubled between 1987 and 2018. And if you live in rural America, your risk of dying from pregnancy-related causes is twice as high as it is for someone in a city. Nearly 100 rural hospitals have closed since 2010. Those that stay open are shutting down their labor and delivery units. So a woman in labor might now face a 2-hour, 3-hour drive on back roads, praying her baby waits. This is the modern incarnation of the frozen pea field. It is a systemic, calculated withdrawal of care. It tells a mother your survival and your baby's survival is not worth the infrastructure. Florence's desperation has been bureaucratized, but what happened to the woman herself? For decades, Florence Owens Thompson receded into the anonymity she feared. She worked. She raised her family. She hated the photograph. To her, it was a monument not to her strength, but to her shame. It was a frozen moment of defeat that the world had been taught to see as noble. Then in the late 1970s, a reporter from a Modesto newspaper tracked her down. She was living in a mobile home in Modesto, California. She was in her 70s. She was furious. She gave an interview, and for the first time, the symbol had a voice, and it was shouting. She said Dorothea Lange had promised the photos would never be published. She said she felt exploited. She spoke of the anger she felt every time she saw the image, which was everywhere. She revealed the humiliating details of that day, the sold tires, the boiled frozen vegetables. The world had gotten the aesthetic of her struggle perfectly, but had missed the truth of it entirely. The publication of her name and her story was a seismic shock. It forced an uncomfortable reevaluation of one of America's most beloved images. It was no longer a timeless portrait of endurance. It was a snapshot of a specific woman, on a specific day, betrayed by specific forces. And it revealed the photographer's moral compromise. Lange had broken her promise to get a world-changing picture, but the system had one final, cruel twist in store for Florence Owens Thompson. In her late 70s, she suffered a stroke. Her medical bills were crippling. Her family, still poor, had to publicly ask for help. They revealed that the woman from one of the most reproduced photographs in history could not pay for her own care. So they did the only thing they could. They asked the public, who had consumed her image for decades, for money. The symbol had to monetize its own suffering to survive. Donations poured in from around the country, eventually covering her bills. She died in 1983, but the lesson was stark. The system that created her desperation, that made her an icon and that forgot her name, had also failed to catch her at the end. She had to be saved once again by the public's fleeting conscience. And that public conscience was about to be tested like never before. Because the forces that created maternity care deserts were not passive. They were the result of active, deliberate choices. And in boardrooms and legislative halls, a new battle was brewing, one that would use mothers and bobbies as political bargaining chips. That battle lines were drawn not in muddy fields but in spreadsheets, and the first weapon was a simple, brutal metric: profitability. A hospital administrator in a rural county doesn't look at a pregnant woman. They look at the bottom line. Delivering bobbies is expensive. It requires a dedicated wing, 24-hour anesthesiology, specialized nurses, and malpractice insurance that can run into the millions. If the number of births falls below a certain threshold, the unit operates at a loss, so it gets shut down. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a calculation, and it has created a landscape where in over 1,200 counties across America, the most dangerous thing a woman can do is get pregnant. But here is where the story twists from neglect into something more active. The withdrawal of care created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped a powerful political narrative. The argument went like this: government intervention in healthcare is inefficient. The free market will provide. Local communities should solve their own problems. It was a sleek, modern repackaging of the old frontier ethos: you are on your own. This narrative was weaponized to block the expansion of Medicaid, the federal state program that pays for nearly half of all births in America in states that needed it most. Politicians argued it was too costly, too bureaucratic. The human cost was dismissed as anecdotal, or worse, as personal failure. The result: in states that refused to expand Medicaid, rural hospital closures skyrocketed, and maternal mortality rates didn't just creep up, they exploded. A study found that in Texas, which rejected Medicaid expansion, the maternal death rate became the highest in the developed world. The system wasn't just failing to catch mothers. It was actively stepping aside. But wait, it gets more personal. Because this isn't just about statistics in a report. It's about what happens in a car speeding down a dark country road at 2 in the morning. Meet Sarah, a fictional name for a very real story playing out right now. Sarah lives in a maternity care desert in the Midwest. The nearest hospital with a labor and delivery unit is 84 miles away. When her contractions started coming fast, she and her husband got in the car. They drove through the darkness, praying. Halfway there, she knew she wasn't going to make it. The baby was coming. They pulled over on the shoulder of a state highway. Her husband called 911. The dispatcher tried to talk him through the delivery. In the backseat under the dome lights, Sarah delivered her own baby. They were lucky. Both survived. But for days after, Sarah shook with a delayed terror, not just from the ordeal, but from the realization of how thin the margin was. Her story is not rare. It is the logical endpoint of a spreadsheet calculation made hundreds of miles away. She is Florence Owens Thompson in a sedan instead of a tent, her crisis just as invisible to the powers that be. And just like in the 1930s, When the public saw the problem, they tried to help. Grassroots groups organized. They raised money for rural clinics. They set up volunteer doula networks. They created apps to connect pregnant women with the few remaining providers. But these efforts, however heroic, were like using a teacup to bail out a flooding ship. They couldn't replace a shuttered hospital. They couldn't legislate Medicaid expansion. They were treating symptoms while the disease metastasized. And the disease had a new, vicious ally, the child care desert. Remember, Florence's crisis was about food and shelter. A modern mother's crisis is often about what happens after the baby is born. The current child care shortage is so acute that 59% of rural communities are classified as child care deserts, an even higher rate than in cities. So, imagine you are a new mother in a rural county. You've survived the pregnancy, maybe you even made it to a hospital. You come home with your newborn, but your maternity leave is unpaid or only lasts 6 weeks. You have to go back to work to keep your family afloat, but there is no child care. Not a single licensed spot for infants in your entire county. Your choices are: quit your job and plunge into poverty, or leave your baby in an unregulated, potentially dangerous situation. This is the 1-2 punch of the modern crisis. First, the system abandons you during birth. Then, it abandons you when you need to recover and provide. The isolation of the Montana homestead has been replicated not by geography alone, but by policy. Now, let's follow the money. Because if care is receding, where is the capital flowing? It's flowing to the ends of the pipeline where the profits are. While rural hospitals close, private equity firms are aggressively buying up urban maternity wards and neonatal intensive care units. They streamline them for maximum profit, often cutting staff and pushing for more interventions like cesarean sections, which are more expensive and billable. The model is simple. Let the public system crumble in poor, rural areas and concentrate the lucrative business of birth in wealthy, urban centers. The maternal health crisis, therefore, isn't a bug in the American system. It's a feature. It is a direct result of health care being treated as a commodity rather than a right. The suffering of mothers and infants has been factored in as an acceptable externality, like pollution from a factory. And this brings us back to the photograph with a chilling clarity. The growers in 1930s California needed a desperate, mobile workforce. Today's economic model needs a precarious, fragmented workforce. A mother trapped at home without child care or terrified of the medical cost of having another baby is a worker with limited options, less likely to demand higher wages or better conditions. Her desperation, once again, is good for business. But the most damning evidence of this systemic betrayal comes from a place that solved the problem a century ago. Remember the frontier nursing service in Kentucky? Their model, community-based, midwife-led care that went to the mother, produced miraculous outcomes. They slashed maternal and infant death rates in one of the poorest regions in the country. We have known what works since the 1920s. The blueprint for saving lives in remote, underserved areas has been sitting in an archive, collecting dust. Its principles are now championed by the World Health Organization as the global gold standard for maternal care. Yet in the United States, midwives face restrictive laws, and community-based birth centers fight for insurance reimbursement and licensing. The proven solution is often illegal or unfunded, while the profitable, high-intervention model is incentivized. So we are left with this staggering reality. We have the knowledge to prevent these deaths. We have the historical proof. We simply lack the political will and the economic incentive to apply it universally, which means every death, every near miss, every Sarah delivering on the highway is a choice. A choice made in a state capitol, a boardroom, or a congressional office. This is the full, horrifying evolution of the machine that created Florence. It has become more sophisticated, more bureaucratic, and even more deadly. It doesn't just create an icon of suffering. It creates a vast, invisible class of women bearing that suffering in silence, their stories buried not in frozen fields but in medical debt and bureaucratic denial letters. But machines, no matter how powerful, have weak points. And the story of the migrant mother holds one final, explosive secret. It's not about how the system broke her. It's about what she did decades later with the only piece of power she ever possessed, her own name. In 1978, a reporter found her. Florence was 75 years old, living in a trailer in Modesto, surviving on Social Security checks and the ghosts of her own legend. She was furious, and for the first time she decided to talk back to the image that had stolen her life. She gave an interview to the Modesto Bee. She named herself. She named her shame. She talked about the sold tires, the frozen vegetables, the feeling of being prey for a camera. She said Dorothea Lange had promised her the photos would not be published. She said she felt exploited. The symbol had found its voice, and it was a roar of betrayal. The article was a shockwave. It forced a fundamental rereading of one of America's most sacred images. Migrant Mother was no longer a timeless portrait of noble suffering. It was evidence of a specific betrayal on a specific day. The photographer, seeking a powerful image, had broken her word to a destitute woman. The art world had to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that a masterpiece was built on a broken promise. For Florence, the act of numbing herself was an exorcism, but it didn't pay the bills. The system had one final, ironic cruelty in store. A few years later, Florence suffered a stroke. The medical bills were catastrophic. Her family, still of modest means, faced a choice: watch her suffer without care or ask for help. So they did the only thing they could. They went public. They told the world that the iconic migrant mother was dying and could not afford her medical care. The public, who had consumed her image for decades, responded. Donations poured in from every state, eventually covering her bills. It was a bittersweet justice. She had to monetize her own iconic suffering to survive the system that created it. Florence Owens Thompson died in September of 1983. Her obituary identified her correctly as the migrant mother. The symbol and the woman were formally fused in death. But her story, and the story of the forces that shaped her, was only beginning its second act, because her children were watching, and they carried a complicated legacy. Some felt pride in their mother's iconic status. Others carried a deep resentment at the exploitation, the poverty that continued, and the way their family's worst moment was framed as art. Her daughter, Catherine, later said, "That photo never gave Mother any happiness, only worry." This family tension reveals the true, lingering cost of turning a person into a symbol. The trauma is inherited. Yet from that inheritance, something unexpected began to grow. Florence's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, aware of their connection to history, began to use it. They didn't shy away from the photograph. They embraced its power, but on their terms. They spoke at museums and universities. They corrected the record. They insisted on telling the full story: the Cherokee heritage, the hard work, the anger, the medical debt. They transformed the legacy from one of passive suffering to one of active testimony. In doing so, they performed the final act of reclamation that Florence started. They became the guardians of the context, ensuring that anyone who saw the famous face would also learn the name and the system that tried to erase it. This act of recontextualization is the most powerful weapon against the machine of anonymity. It is happening today, not just with Florence's image, but with the modern mothers in care deserts. Women are using smartphones instead of Graflex cameras, but the principle is the same. They are documenting their journeys, the 3-hour drives, the closed hospital signs, the bills they cannot pay. They are posting them online, tagging legislators, speaking to reporters. They are forcing their specific, named stories into the public eye, refusing to be silent statistics. They are the spiritual descendants of Florence, but with a crucial advantage. They own their own narratives from the start. And in some places, it is working. The relentless pressure of named, human stories has pushed some states to finally expand Medicaid, throwing a lifeline to rural hospitals. Community groups, inspired by the old frontier nursing service model, are fighting to license midwives and open freestanding birth centers in deserts, providing that proven community-based care. The battle is far from over, but the strategy is clear: make the crisis visible, specific, and personal. Now let's return to the photograph one last time with all the context we now have. Look at it. You no longer see just a mother. You see Florence. You see the frozen peas. You see the sold tires. You see the broken promise. You see the Cherokee child who became a cotton-picking mother of 7. You see the economic machinery that required her desperation. And you see the beginning of a fight to be seen as human that would last her entire life and beyond. That is the true power of the image, not as a symbol of what was done to her, but as a map of how she fought back. By reclaiming her name, Florence Owens Thompson performed the ultimate act of resistance. She reminded everyone that behind every symbol is a person, and people are not meant to be used, they are meant to be seen. The final, surprising detail in this story is not about Florence, but about the photograph itself. For decades, the image was controlled by the government and later by corporate archives. It was licensed for textbooks, documentaries, and posters. It generated significant income, but that income never went to Florence or her family, not a cent. The system that documented her poverty profited from it while she remained poor. It is the perfect, unflinching metaphor for the entire story. Value extracted, life left behind. So what are we left with? A famous picture, a named woman, and a system that still asks mothers to bear impossible burdens. The geography has changed from pea fields to care deserts. The technology has changed from box cameras to smartphones. But the fundamental question remains the same. When a mother is in crisis, do we see a symbol to consume or a person to save? Florence's life, in all its hardship and defiance, forces us to answer. And that answer will determine whether the story that began in a frozen tent in 1936 is a relic of the past or a warning for our future. So the photograph remains. But now when you look at it, you have a choice. You can see what the system wanted you to see, a silent symbol of endurance, or you can see what was really there. A woman named Florence in a fight for her children's survival at the mercy of a machine that saw her only as fuel. This is the tension at the heart of her story, and at the heart of every story where human need meets institutional indifference. The machinery that stranded her in Nipomo never really went away. It evolved. It learned to speak in the language of market forces and actuarial tables. It learned to hide in policy and in the quiet closure of a hospital wing hundreds of miles from the capital. But its function remained the same, to treat the most vulnerable as a cost to be managed, rather than as lives to be protected. The legacy of Florence Owens Thompson, therefore, is not a single image. It is a question. A question we answer every day with our attention, our votes, and our willingness to look past the symbol to the person. When we see a statistic about a maternity care desert, do we see a logistical problem, or do we see a specific mother in a specific town calculating her risk in the dark? When we hear about a child care shortage, do we see an economic indicator or a woman having to choose between her job and her baby? The moment we can hold both truths in our mind, the systemic force and the individual human caught in its gears, is the moment the machine's power begins to fade. Because these systems rely on our abstraction. They rely on us seeing numbers, not faces. Florence's greatest rebellion was to force her face and her name back into the frame. She refused to be an abstraction, and in that she gave us a blueprint. The work now is to do for others what she eventually did for herself, to restore the name, the context, the specific dignity to every story that the machine tries to simplify and silence. It is happening in community meetings, in courtrooms, and in the quiet determination of families refusing to be statistics. The story that began in a frozen field is not over. It is being written in every county without a doctor, in every legislative session where care is debated as a commodity, and in every home where a mother does the calculus her country has failed to solve. We end where we began, with a face turned from the camera. But now we know what was in the darkness just outside the frame, and knowing that changes everything. If you want to see more stories that pull back the curtain on the hidden forces shaping our world, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next one.